Three major cases led to the functional discovery of Broca's area. The first was a Frenchman who attempted to commit suicide by shooting himself in the head. Somehow, he missed the majority of his head and ended up shattering his frontal bone, which ended up being flipped upward like a fin. His brain remained intact. The doctor pressed on his brain that was pulsating through his wound. When Broca's area was pressed, he suddenly couldn't speak, even though he could earlier. The doctor did it over and over again, seeing the same result. The theory of localization in the brain was disregarded at the time, barely even brought up, until a scientist read an account of this case at a meeting in Paris on April 4, 1861. Paul Broca, anatomist and surgeon, was in attendance as a secretary. Paul Broca was fascinated by the skull. He himself didn't believe in localization until he met Ton. Ton was an epileptic since a child, whose real name was Le Borgne. Being an epileptic for so long with 1800s treatment, he lost his ability to speak. By age 31, his only response to questions was Ton Ton, which became his nickname. He was committed to a half-hospital, half-nursing home, where he became an angry person, and people discovered he could curse at people in complete sentences only when enraged. His condition worsened, and he eventually lost all feeling in his right arm and became paralyzed in his right leg. He developed gangrene so bad that it needed an amputation and was presented to surgeon Paul Broca on April 12, 1861. Broca eventually realized that Ton could still answer some questions with his fingers, and that he just couldn't find the words to speak except for Ton Ton. Broca performed the amputation, but Ton was in terrible shape and died April 17th. Broca was still curious from the meeting and opened his skull, finding it a mess, but realized that the worst part was near the back of the frontal lobe, exactly where the doctor reported to have pressed the spatula on the earlier case, causing Broca to conclude it was the language node. Broca ended up presenting his findings at the same meeting, but just very briefly describing his conclusion. Broca preserved Ton's brain, looking for other aphasics, finding another patient named Lilo. He too earned his nickname by the few words he spoke, which translate to Lilo, yes, no, and his attempt at 3, which he used for all numbers. His actual name was Monsieur Lelong, and he had a stroke 18 months before he met Broca in October of 1861, which caused his language deficit. He too could mime and use his fingers to represent numbers, even though he'd say 3 each time, or always for every other word. Lilo died of complications from a broken femur, which gave Broca the opportunity to perform a brain autopsy. The results were much clearer this time. Lelong's brain only had damage the size of a BB, which was in the same location as the other two, the back of the frontal lobe. Broca was convinced that this location was a language node and presented it. More doctors referred him aphasics, and after 25 autopsies, every one had damage in the rear frontal lobe, which sealed his case and gave this location the name Broca's area.
Broca's area is located in the lower portion left hemisphere in the frontal lobe. It is responsible for the production and execution of speech and controls all motor functions associated with it. Broca's area was discovered by a French neurosurgeon, Paul Broca, who studied the brains of individuals with language and speech difficulties. 3 major functions include speech production, facial muscle control, and language processing. It directs the muscles involved in speech production in order to physically produce sounds and words. Although it is mainly involved in speech, we use it also to plan voluntary motor activities other than it. Damage to this area can result in Broca's aphasia, which is the inability to produce language. In many cases, a person can understand language perfectly but not be able to produce an understandable response.
Both of these patients experienced injuries and lesions to the left inferior lateral frontal gyrus of the brain when Broca performed their autopsies. Tan and Lalo both suffered from a degree of Broca's aphasia. It is the inability of speech function. For example, these patients knew what was being asked of them, but they did not know how to respond with their speech. In the article, it is stated that Tan's epilepsy damaged his ability to speak. Epilepsy is involved in neurodegenerative diseases. According to the National Aphasia Association, primary progressive aphasia can be caused by neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. Lalo most likely dealt with the common Broca's aphasia due to his illness background. Lalo's symptoms included only being able to respond with 5 words. However, he knew what was being said because he responded with his hands. This results from a stroke or brain injury. Lalo incurred a stroke 18 months before meeting Broca, which led to the discovery of a language node in the brain.
Broca advanced the field of neuroscience through research and experiments. Tan and Lilo were his 2 main patients that he experimented on to prove his theory of cerebral localization of speech within the frontal lobe. In the patients that were examined, the right sides of their brains were found to be normal. This meant the frontal localization of language is only in the left hemisphere of the brain. Now this section of the brain is referred to as the brocas area and is defined as being associated with speech production.
When this area of the brain is damaged, that person can spontaneously speak, not make sense, and have extreme difficulty writing. However, the person with damage to the Broca's area can still understand written and spoken language. From Broca's discovery, 2 speech disorders, aphemia and verbal amnesia, were found. Aphemia is expressive aphasia, and verbal amnesia is the loss of memory of both spoken and written words.